Now, during the American Civil War, you'll hear about General Grant, you'll hear about General Lee, maybe you hear about a handful of battles, maybe you hear about the Anaconda Plan, but you don't really hear any more than that. And it's kind of a travesty that the Navy is not talked about enough in the American Civil War because it plays this absolutely crucial part in the war, and it leads to the downfall of the Confederacy. Now, there are a ton of things that lead to the downfall of it, like the collapsing of the railroads in the Confederate South is extremely important to the war ending as soon as it did. The South just was not industrialized. They relied heavily on imports and exports, so the blockade that the Navy ran was extremely important. And it's all these different factors. But on a list of things that was important to the downfall of the Confederacy, the blockade the Navy ran is high up on that list, like extremely high up. And it is a travesty that the Navy is not talked about more. So if you have not guessed already, today's episode is going to be on the American Navy in the Civil War. Now, at the outbreak of the war, the Union has a whopping 90 ships to its name. Now, only about 40 of these are combat ready, but combat ready is a lot better than not being seaworthy, because combat ready can mean 1,000 different things. But whatever. The other important thing is that most, and when I mean most, I really do mean almost all, of the Union sailors in the Navy stay aligned with the Union. They just stay with the Navy and they fight with them, which is great. It's fantastic. The same cannot be said for the Union naval officers at the start of the war. You have hundreds of Union officers being fired, they desert, they just flat out leave their positions, all these different things. But you have almost 300 of them that just up and leave day one of the war beginning for one reason or another. Now, 300 doesn't sound like a whole lot, except the Navy only has about 90 ships. So 300 officers equates to about 40% of all of the Navy officers in that part, which is devastating in the short term. Now, we fixed this pretty quickly, but in the moment, it was devastating. Now, the important thing is that even though they only have around 40 ships, and they did lose a couple hundred officers, they are still better than the Confederates. The Confederates at the outbreak of the war have 30 ships to their name of varying sizes, and only 14 of them are seaworthy. Now, when you work in a country that doesn't have the right wood to make ships, or doesn't have the industry to make them seaworthy, that is a very large task to get moving. So the Confederates not having a good time. They also have no real good naval yards compared to the North. The North has tons of massive navy yards that have dry docks that they can make ships in, do really in-depth repairs. The South has the Pensacola Navy Yard, which is smaller than what the North has, and they do get the Portsmouth Navy Yard, but they can't really utilize it that well. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, April 12th of 1861, Fort Sumter is fired on, and the war begins. And this really, really makes everything going to hyperdrive. Because beforehand, the Union is getting somewhat ready for war. The South is already somewhat ready for war, but this begins, the official formalities, and everybody's really ramping up. Now, April 19th, the Anaconda Plan goes into effect, and this is to blockade the southern states from being able to get any help from the outside nations, which is important because the South relies extremely heavily on imports and exports. It's absolutely vital to their economy. So if you can stop that, you can cripple the Confederates before it even begins. Now, the Anaconda Plan is planned out months before the war begins. Like, they were already planning all these crazy things, but had they enacted the Anaconda Plan before the war begins, then they would have started the war themselves, because that blockade would have been seen as an act of war. But it doesn't matter if it's seen as an act of war if the war's already going on. So, April 19th, the Anaconda Plan goes into effect, and on April 20th, you have the evacuation of the Portsmouth Navy Yards. Now, this is the Navy Yard. This is the Navy Yard for all Navy Yards. And the Union evacuates it very poorly. We end up leaving 8 ships behind in very good condition that the Confederates capture and use for their own. We leave 1,000 naval cannons behind that the Confederates can use on their own. You have these really pristine dry docks that they can repair their ships in and refuel their ships. It's devastating. Now, the Confederates don't get to utilize it as good as they could have because the North has everything that you would need to make a ship. The North has all of the crazy large trees to make those ships. They have all the coal and the iron. The South, you can't build a boat out of cotton. So they can resupply their ships, they can fix their ships, but most importantly, they are denying the North the use of that Navy Yard. And that's really the big effect of them taking that, is just denying the Union of it. But we get it back, so all's well that ends well, I guess. So the Confederates are controlling Portsmouth. They have a small navy, but nothing too crazy, and they're relying heavily on imports and exports. So it's vital that the Union takes out these imports and exports. But they don't really have the ships to enact this blockade. So a bunch of guys get together and they go, okay, well, what if instead of using ships above the waterline to deter people from trading with the Confederacy, we use ships below the waterline to deter people from trading with the Confederacy? And no, they're not using submarines. Submarines wouldn't be used for another year afterwards. What they come up with is this brilliant idea. And looking at the image on the screen here, you probably couldn't guess what it is. They decide that they are going to take about 20 ships, they're going to load them down with stones, they are going to tow them into Charleston Harbor, and they are going to intentionally sink them in the harbor. Because if nobody can get into the harbor, then they don't have to worry about blockading the harbor. Because why would you blockade a harbor that nobody can get to? And this quote-unquote stone fleet doesn't really work too well. You have a bunch of ships that sink before they get to their destination. The ships that do sink in weird places, they sink in weird ways, and again, just not a super good effect. But the point is that we can do that. And to drill that point home, they do it a second time with 20 more ships. But just like one of the weird things that happens in the Civil War as a way of like, could this work? I don't know. Let's try it. Okay, that didn't work. Let's not do that again. But whatever, it's fine. It has the added benefit of making Robert E. Lee like just incredibly angry. Robert E. Lee had a lot of really hateful things to say about the North adding this little stone fleet, but whatever, stay mad, you lost. Now, you also have Navy ships blockading these ports because they only have around 40 to 45 ships at this time. It's nothing too crazy yet. And really, it is less of a blockade and more of a we're going to do a blockade, and to kick us off, here is us deterring you. Don't do this. And these ships are posted outside of just strategic ports. It's like a handful of ships outside of Charleston and a handful of ships outside of Wilmington, North Carolina, because that's all we could afford. But it works fine-ish. The important thing is that the Union sees this need for ships, and by the end of 1861, we went from about 40 combat-ready ships to 250 ships, because we bought, we built, we took just ships from all over the place. And it's not crazy large warships. It is, you have a 40-foot sailboat. Ha, well, perfect, because we only need 30 feet to slap a cannon on it. So they slap a cannon on a 40-foot sailboat and they call it good and they send it off to the blockade. And most of the ships had more than one cannon, but there are several instances of ships with one or two cannons enforcing this blockade. Because even if that ship cannot realistically take down a bigger boat, the point is that it deters other ships from doing so. It can warn them, and maybe it gets lucky and takes out that ship. And it just makes the scale of like, is it worth it, slightly more to the no side. Now, you also have an incredible amount of ships on the Mississippi that are being used as troop transports. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. But the Mississippi does play an incredible role in the Civil War naval-wise, because the Mississippi is wide enough to support certain ships. Now, 1861 doesn't see a crazy amount of naval engagements. And that's because the Union doesn't have a whole lot of officers. They're trying to get their ships ready from, not combat ready to combat ready. The Confederates know that they can't really compete with the Union yet. They need troops for other things. You have massive land battles that are going off right now. Really, it's more of an organization year rather than like a fighting year. 1862, though, is a fighting unit. There are several massive naval engagements that happen. This image on the screen here might be familiar to some of you guys, especially if you happen to be a 4th or 5th grade teacher teaching history in Seattle. And this is the Battle of Hampton Roads. You might not recognize the name, but you should recognize the ships that are involved. So the Battle of Hampton Roads begins in March of 1862. And the first day, you have the CSS Virginia, the ship on the left, and it tries to take on the Union blockade, punch a hole straight through it. And it does. It takes out 2 large Union warships by itself and makes a third one run aground. That is a resounding naval victory. At any point in history, one ship taking out 3 ships, undeniably just a win. On the second day of Hampton Roads, however, the ship on the right shows up, and that's going to be the USS Monitor. This is the first time 2 ironclad warships go off against each other, and armor advancements have advanced faster than cannon advancements. So you had these 2 ships plinking away at each other for 3 or 4 hours, except their guns are not big enough to actually do anything to each other, so they both end up just sailing in opposite directions after about 4 hours because neither of them can do anything to each other. Except the blockade stays in place. So, yes, it was a tactical victory for the South. They did take out 3 warships, but the blockade stays in place. So, definitely Confederate victory, but overall the Union still, keeps the upper hand with the blockade. Now, in March of 1862, you have the Battle of New Orleans. Not the Johnny Horton song, the other Battle of New Orleans. Now, in this one, you have 2 forts on either side of the river of the Mississippi. This is the beautiful Mississippi River that I've drawn out. And you have the Union Navy taking troop transports and gunboats, and they successfully managed to run past the forts, up the river, and deposit their troops just north of New Orleans. And they take New Orleans, and it's great. It's fantastic. The forts fall, and now the Union controls New Orleans, which has 2 major effects. The first one is that the Confederates now only have 1 major trading port, that being Charleston, South Carolina, and 2, the Union now controls the Mississippi River, which is huge, massive. Now, the Confederates lose New Orleans, and with that, just an incredible amount of their trade. Also, because they now no longer have New Orleans, they cannot sail any ships in or out of the river. So you have a handful of Confederate boats that are up here by Memphis, just hanging around. Well, the Union says, no, that's not going to fly with us. So a month later, you have the Union taking Memphis, Tennessee. And in the invasion of Memphis, Tennessee, the Union Navy successfully annihilates what is left of the Confederate Navy up here. Big explosion. So with this invasion of Memphis, not only do we take the city, obviously, but we also have made it to the point where, other than a couple forts in Vicksburg down towards the middle here, we own the Mississippi. Like, we can sail ships up and down all day long, and the Confederates won't have a ship to attack us with. And that's huge. Massive. Now, you also have, at the end of the year in December, the U.S. taking Galveston, Texas, mostly unattacked. It's pretty nice. It's pretty easy. And that's just one less, port that the Confederates can trade out of. So, go U.S. 1862. So we lost Galveston, Texas. A couple weeks after we invade Galveston, Texas in December of 1862, we lose Galveston, Texas, January 1st of 1863. The Confederates end up taking it back with a surprise attack. They take out the city pretty easily, and they end up capturing 2 American ships. So, not great. Also, early on in 1863, the Union Navy is handed a defeat at Fort Hinman in Arkansas and Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Fort Hinman, Arkansas is taken by the Union Army. It is just a loss handed to the Union Navy. So, 1863 doesn't go off too well at the beginning for the Union Navy. That does not mean that it was not a successful year for us. We just had to find our footing really quick. You have General Grant. This image here might be familiar to some of you guys, and this is General Grant in the United States Navy running the guns. So Vicksburg is the last holdout on the Mississippi, and they have a ton of coastal batteries facing down into the river. So General Grant is trying to take Vicksburg, and it's too well defended from the northern side. So with the Navy, they take a bunch of gunboats and troop transports, and in the cover of darkness, sail down the river past all these coastal batteries and successfully run the guns. Only one ship is sunk, and then Vicksburg falls. Once Vicksburg falls, the Mississippi is the Union's. It is exclusively the Union's. They have control of New Orleans. There is no Navy left after Memphis, and they have Vicksburg. That's it. We can run as much stuff up and down as we want, and we have successfully cut the Confederacy in half. Because since we own the Mississippi, they can't move people across. And it is just absolutely wonderful for the Union. It's the greatest thing to happen. It's amazing. And that's kind of where the wins end for the Union Navy for a little bit. You have the Union Navy going into Charleston Harbor for a second time and being repulsed for a second time. And we lose that somewhat badly. But then we have a pretty cool event, like a Mission Impossible style event happening down in South Florida. You have the Union Navy firing on a fort down there to distract them. And they're not trying to take the fort, they're just trying to distract the fort from what's happening a couple miles north, where a naval landing party manages to successfully get on the beach and travel 14 miles inland, where they successfully raise a ton of Confederate blockade runners. Because if you can't get them at sea, just wait until they get inland, and then you can burn them down. And they burn them down, the landing party manages to make it back to the boats, and they sail off into the sunset. That's it. And it's one of my favorite stories from the Civil War, because it is just so like a Mission Impossible movie. We're going to land these guys on the beach. They're going to go find these ships. They're going to burn them down, and they're going to sneak back. It's fantastic. You also have the blockade, which is increasing in number day by day. Fantastic. It's going great. And you also have this blockade becoming so effective that Britain and France no longer trade with the Confederacy. Now, this is not because the blockade alone. The Confederacy is already going downhill in 1863. But the backing of Britain and France via trade of cotton is important to the Confederates. And once they back out, they no longer have any major trading partners, and their economy just bottoms out as if it wasn't already, but it just bottoms out even more. So 1863, great year for the Union. Fantastic. Now, 1864, the naval war is winding down. The Confederate Navy doesn't really have too much of a navy left to fight with, and even then, most of their resources are going towards the Army, which is getting handed more and more defeats at this point. So, you have February of 1864, where the CSS Hunley, the first submarine used in combat, sinking another vessel, which is a success. The vessel does sink, and the Hunley also sinks. The Hunley used a bomb basically at the end of a stick tied to the submarine, and the explosion ruptured the Hunley's hull, and nobody knows exactly how the crew died, but one of the theories is that basically the explosion was so powerful and the ship was too close that the crew's blood vessels kind of just popped. But also, the boat wasn't made too well. It had sank 3 times prior, I believe, and killed the crew 3 times prior as well. It's not a good ship to be in. So you also have the Union being handed a defeat in April, which is not good. But the biggest thing to happen, arguably, in 1864, not necessarily like gonna end the war big, but morale-wise, is the Union finally tracks down the CSS Alabama. The CSS Alabama is this little 8-gun ship, but it is wicked fast. It is incredibly fast. It doesn't matter if a blockade is in place if you're so fast the blockade can't catch you. And that's kind of the thinking of the CSS Alabama. So the CSS Alabama is just running past this blockade left and right. But we finally track it down outside of Cherbourg, France. And it realizes that it can't stay in port, and if it leaves port, it's gonna get sunk. But it tries to get out anyway. And it goes and it fights the Union And that's what this image on the screen is here. The one on fire is the CSS Alabama. The ship sinks, and the Confederates lose their best blockade runner of the war. And again, it doesn't end the war, but huge part is that we finally take out the CSS Alabama. Now, the other big thing that happens is that we take down another fort in Mobile Bay, Alabama. This effectively closes off Mobile, Alabama to Confederate shipping. The Confederates are just losing ports left and right, and as they're losing them, their imports and exports continue to decline. And with Mobile Bay, that's kind of it. Like, they have Charleston, they have a couple other places, but Mobile Bay is one of the other big ones, and now it's gone too. The blockade is also just stopping an incredible amount of ships by 1864. There are hundreds and hundreds of ships in this blockade now, and the Confederates are really feeling this blockade, as well as a couple other things. But it's gotten to the point that their inflation has risen thousands of percents. You have troops not being able to be clothed properly. It is wild. And again, it's winding down because the Confederates don't have a navy left. Now, in 1865, you have 2 more naval engagements that happen, and then the war is over. The first one is that the Union Navy makes another pass on Fort Fisher, which is in Wilmington, North Carolina. And with this, they successfully close off the last Atlantic port for the Confederates. After Fort Fisher falls, that's it. They have no more ports. It's 1865. They're already on the run everywhere, but done. Now, the other big thing is that the Union Navy does play a part in the siege of Richmond and Petersburg. Really, it's more of a like sailing kind of inland and then denying the Confederates from resupplying their troops, but they do have a part in it. And then after that, that's the last nail. A couple months later, the war ends. The Navy at the end of the war now has over 600 ships, which is more than any other Navy in the world at that time, which is fascinating because in the span of 4 years, you go from 40 combat ready ships to 600 plus ships in service. And that term of biggest Navy in the world is kind of a little exaggerated because yes, it was the biggest in terms of like sheer number of boats, but it wasn't necessarily the most powerful in the sense of like if you put all of the American boats versus all the British boats, the Britain Navy might win more times out of 10. But the Americans have more boats, if that makes any sense. I don't know. The same thing's happening in China, which is also really fascinating. If you want to look that up too, the Chinese Navy has an incredible amount of ships. It's way more than the American Navy has, but the American Navy is a lot more advanced and we have a lot better ships. Like the quality of the ships is better. So, kind of something that happens there, but it's really fascinating. So, yeah, the Union Navy, super large part in the Civil War. It's a travesty they're not talked about more. So if you enjoyed this video, I hope I'll see you guys in the next one. See you.